60 folks, over 55. Jeremy, am I right that there's a limit on our Zoom meeting of 100? Is that right?
There's 100 limit, so I think we might reach that, which is
yeah. And first of all, I just wanted to say what a special evening this is for me, and thank you to Yoko and Alex, and thank you to Jeremy and Monique for putting this together. This is one of the times that I've been able to really gather the CT NOFA community together this spring, since we've all been in such dire straits with this pandemic. And I was just so happy today through my work at the farm to be thinking of what I see as a real need for some good news in our state. And Yoko and Alex are some of the best news we have going in Connecticut right now. And in Connecticut farming, I think they really are going to be give us a spectacular evening. So I'm glad that we're coming together. I think one of the things that I also wanted to touch on as we begin is the sort of larger context of the work that Yoko and Alex are doing with Connecticut NOFA and with NOFA Massachusetts and farmers in New Jersey. This project initially was funded by an NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant, and the work is intended to promote soil health, but one of the specific angles of it on this project is on organics and no-till or tillage reduction. There are myriad reasons for us to be pursuing this kind of thinking and this kind of research. Primary to me and closest to my heart is the climate change resilience issue. Emily Cole from American Farmland Trust noted that a 1% increase in soil carbon or in the organic matter in your soil equates to a 20-ton drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's 1% per acre times every acre in production in Connecticut. A 1% change could really go a huge way to mitigating some of the most disastrous effects of the climate situation that we're facing. So for that reason, Yoko and Alex are out there saving the world today. And I am thrilled to spend this evening with you guys. The soil health issue and the tillage reduction issue really gets to the heart of the NOFA mission as well. And in addition to all of the exciting things that are happening in the soil on their 3/4 acre, it's also worth noting that these guys are beginning farmers, and they are going to be sort of, I think, thought leaders and practice leaders. And it's that pairing of thought and practice which really makes this CIG project so exciting. So throughout the evening, it sounds like we will bounce back and forth from through a couple of different presentations. And we'll hear from Yoko and Alex first for a farm tour. Following that, we'll have a little time for Q&A. They'll hopefully come in out of the rain and be able to sit with us and dig deep into some of our questions about what we see. And then after that hour, we will hear, or after however much time our questions take, we will hear from Caro Roszell, who is joining us from NOFA Massachusetts. And Caro is largely responsible for this Conservation Innovation Grant and the tillage reduction work that we're doing. So without further ado, I will mute myself and turn my video off so that we can focus on Alex and Yoko. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, so I'm Yoko.
And I'm Alex.
And I think that's the only time you're going to see our faces until the Q&A starts. So we're going to head on over to our slides. So we're the owners and operators of Assawaga Farm. We're a 3/4 acre diversified vegetable market garden. We are located in northeastern Connecticut. So that puts us in zone 6A for those of you who are not local or in Connecticut. And so we found our property in 2016, and we spent 2 years planning and building our infrastructure and started our first season in 2018. And so this year will be our third season on our farm. And today we'll be covering these topics. So we'll start off with the what, who, when, and where of our farm. And then we'll touch on how we got started with no-till and what we think of it. And then we'll go to our virtual farm tour. And unfortunately, we won't be able to walk around live because our phones, our Google phones, can't handle more than 5 minutes on Zoom. So we have this pre-recorded video from yesterday when it was nice and sunny. And so we'll be playing that and then pausing throughout and explaining what's happening in the video. And then we'll come back to the slides and cover topics more in depth on cover crops, soil coverage, mulching amendments, tools, and stuff like that. And then we'll talk a little bit about no-till, or maybe not even related to no-till, but just pests in general that we're encountering. And then we'll finish with our future plans and dreams for our farm. Oh, so our friends were able to come to our farm about a week ago, and they brought a drone, and they were able to take this really cool footage, this bird's eye view of our farm that kind of tells you, or just shows you what our farm looks like, so you can kind of get an idea as we start to describe, what we're doing. So take a look. So I'm just spreading some fertilizer here for our Solanaceae beds that we planted eggplants and peppers into the following day. So that's what I'm doing. And you'll see there's a field behind the greenhouse. So a total of 6 field blocks. And then I'll, I'm still getting used to this. Oh. Okay.
So our farm is divided into 6 fields and a greenhouse or a high tunnel. We don't necessarily heat the whole structure. It's a 30 by 72 greenhouse, and the first 20 feet of it are our propagation space. So early in the spring, we'll hang a partition up and block off that 20 feet and only heat that so we can get some of our early stuff going. The rest of the greenhouse is 50 feet of in-ground beds. It works out to 8 50-foot beds. All of our beds on our farm, whether they're in the greenhouse or in the field, are all standardized. So they're all 30 inches wide, and they all have 1-foot pathways between them. So as I mentioned, out in the field, we have 6 of them, 6 field blocks. And when we first started the farm, we opened up 3 fields, each of which was about 57 feet wide by 100 feet long. And that gave us 16 100-foot beds. So after growing with that for a season, the following year, we decided that we would double in size. So we opened up 3 additional fields. And we decided that we would break those 100-foot beds into 50 feet and put a 1-foot walkway down the middle. Not a lot, but many of our plantings are 50 feet. So it helps us to break things up rather than, it can get a little messy if you don't really have a clear delineation of where the bed ends. But it also allows us to move around the farm a lot easier if there's big kale planting or tomatoes, something that instead of having to walk 100 feet to get to the end, we can cut through, and it helps with harvesting. So all of that totaled comes out to an even 10,000 bed feet. We're just over 3/4 of an acre. That's including the paths. And for our annual production, we won't get any bigger than that. That's maxed out. But we do intend to put in some perennial space. We're going to put in some pollinator habitats and hedgerow, maybe do some fruit trees and berry production on the edges of the field. But for annuals, this is our size. We built a timber frame barn. When we bought the property, there was nothing on it. So that was a strategic move too, because it's very easy to break up that space. And underneath our porch, we have our wash station. It's outdoors, so we're kind of at the mercy of the elements, but it works out okay. It's 12 by 24, and we use a 100-gallon Rubbermaid tank to do all of our washing. Right adjacent to that, just inside the barn, is a 12 by 12 bay that we built a walk-in cooler into. It is powered by a CoolBot, which is amazing. If you don't know about those, we definitely recommend looking them up. And we have a 24,000 BTU AC unit. It keeps it around 40 degrees, 39 degrees, keeps everything nice and fresh. Usually it's not more than 15, 20 minutes from harvest to being put in the cooler. And then adjacent to that inside is another 12 by 12 bay utility room that we use to grow microgreens. We have shelving set up with grow lights. We can get things started early in there, put stuff on heat mats. During the summer, we'll start our lettuce plantings in there because it's a little too hot for them to germinate well in the greenhouse. So this just gives an even temperature. We also store our minerals, which we'll talk about our mineralization later. But things that are volatile that need to be in the dark or just in constant temperature and humidity, that can all be stored in there. And then during tomato season and when we have storage crops, it's kind of like a makeshift root cellar. We can put stuff in there and keeps it fresh.
So we grow certified organic vegetables. If you follow us on social media, you might know that we focus on Japanese varieties and vegetables. We have a big plant sale in the spring. We usually take our plant sales to the Boston Japan Festival at the end of April. And we also have an on-farm plant sale twice in May, and then we take them to the farmers markets in May and early June. We grow most crops, including potatoes, sweet potatoes. We are taking a break from winter squash this year because, as you can see, our beds are really close together, and it's just been really difficult trying to grow winter squash in that kind of limited space. We've tried trellising. We've tried a whole bunch of things, and it just keeps spreading onto the beds next to it and just spilling over. And we've had, experiences in the past where it's just completely engulfed the beds next to it. So until we figure out a better plan, we aren't going to plant those. But this season we're going to try growing Brussels sprouts and artichokes, so that's really exciting. So it's just the two of us who grows from March to November. We don't hire anybody. We don't have volunteers. It's worked out really well because, we're a beginning farm and our systems are just constantly changing. So it just allows us to be very flexible when, we're just on our own. So the first two seasons, we usually work 7 days a week from March to end of October. We definitely predict that to be the same this year too, given the situation. But our days are pretty relaxed. It's not super hectic every day. We actually take our time and, do things well and thoroughly. So it's not too overwhelming for us. And we also expect that working hours will start to decrease every year as we complete one-off projects and add tools and machinery that'll sort of cut the labor time. But given the situation, we are considering adding more marketing outlets, and in that case we'll be growing a bit more, and we might find local help to help us on harvest days. So we start our first seeds on the first Monday of March, and as I mentioned, plant sales from April to June, farmers markets run from May to November, basically until the week before Thanksgiving. And by that time, we are basically just done with the season. We choose not to grow or sell during the winter, but this gives us time during the winter to work on farm projects that you really can't do during the season. And then it also gives us an opportunity to go to Japan, where most of my family lives, and we get to visit farms and get to learn from them about their small scale farming techniques and other, great stuff. So we sell at 2 farmers markets. I do the one in Brookline on Thursdays, and Alex does the one in Somerville on Saturdays. We have one helper who lives locally that helps us at the market. We sell to a restaurant in Worcester for any excess or market leftovers. And then starting this year, we've started selling to Marichi Japanese supermarket because our farmers markets in the city has just not been quite as good as in the years past, but we'll see what happens.
So we wanted to take a minute to talk about no-till, why we're no-till, what it means to us. But before we do that, we just wanted to make it a point to say that we feel that it's important not to be dogmatic about no-till. Tillage definitely has its place, and it is a valuable tool in some circumstances. There are also tillage techniques that are interesting, like strip tillage really interests me. So back when we were conceptualizing the farm, we went to go see J.M. Fortier speak, of market gardener fame. And he's not really a no-till farmer. He uses power harrow, rotary plow, things like that, and walk behind tractor. But we came away from that really inspired to start a market garden. And it wasn't until maybe a year or so later we had the opportunity to go to see Brian O'Hara's farm, Tobacco Road Farm in Lebanon, Connecticut, which is now about 45 minutes south of us. And if you don't know Brian, he's kind of a no-till guru. And when we went to his farm, we were just absolutely blown away by the quality of his produce, his systems, the lack of disease and pests. It was a wonderland. It was amazing. And that was the first time we had ever seen no-till in practice. No-till has been kind of a fringe agricultural technique, and it's not really widespread to the point where you can just go down the street to see it at a farm. So had we known about it earlier, we probably would have gravitated towards it. But when we saw that, it really just clicked. So we left Brian's and we were just committed to being no-till from then on. So our no-till practices, the baseline is that everything we do is focused on feeding the soil. The soil and the soil biology is paramount at our farm. And we truly believe that if we feed and take care of the soil, it will feed and take care of us. Rather than putting our transplants into dirt, we like to think about that we're plugging them into a living system. So if you look at this picture that we have up on the screen, this is from our greenhouse from earlier this year. And it's one of the things that we really love about no-till is just the massive amount of fungal life that exists on our farm. In the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, we have just massive flushes of mushrooms. And then when we're transplanting throughout the season, you'll reach your hand in the soil and you'll just smell the mycelium, you'll smell the mushrooms. And that's really important to us. If you think about what's going on underneath our feet, there's a complex economy that's playing out. And the players are plant roots and bacteria, micro and macroorganisms, and they're all trading nutrients and sugars and carbon. And mycelium is kind of the director of that. We're big fans of Paul Stamets, very famous mycologist, and he refers to mycelium as being nature's internet. So if you think about it, mycelium is the way that all of these different organisms and plants and creatures that are living in the soil, they communicate with each other, and they are able to have this economy and transfer all these things necessary for life. So in a healthy soil system, you really want a 1-to-1 ratio of bacteria and fungal life. Unfortunately, tillage is not very kind to mycelium. Bacteria is very opportunistic, so as long as there's a food source, it's going to consume it and multiply, and they'll take over, and you'll end up with a soil that is very high in bacteria and very low in mycology. But the mycelium, it gets chopped up and it grows much more slowly and more intentionally the way the hyphae move through the soil. So every time you till, you're kind of resetting its growth back to zero. So by not tilling, we're really allowing that fungal growth to direct that economy. And some of the things that we see coming from that are stronger plants, less disease, longer shelf life. We've had customers at our markets tell us that our lettuce mix will last up to 3 weeks in their fridge and still be perfectly fresh. And something that we kind of hypothesize is that because there's more access to all that nutrients and everything, and it's being traded more, maybe the vegetables themselves are more nutritionally dense. That's something that we can't really quantify right now, but we are members of the Bionutrient Food Association, and they are working on testing tools so that we can quantify that. So we're hoping that in the future, we're going to be able to put that to the test on our farm and really be able to put some science behind what we feel is happening with that. So that's just kind of an overview of what drew us to no-till and our practices and what we focus on. It's all about the soil health. So we're going to now play a video, a pre-recorded video of our farm. We're going to walk around all our fields, and we played it a little bit earlier, and it seems like there was a little lag depending on your connection, but we will pause occasionally and the video will catch up. So just please bear with us. We'll pause very often.
Okay, so welcome to our farm. This is the entrance to our farm and leads us to the heart of our farm, which is the greenhouse. You'll see that the greenhouse is covered in what's called solar wrap, and it's basically a giant bubble wrap. Instead of having to have 2 layers of plastic inflated for insulation, it by itself, it's a good insulated material, and it also diffuses light evenly, which is great for our plants. But our biggest appeal to them was that there are farmers in Europe that have been using it for decades, and so it eliminates the need to recover our greenhouse every 4 or 5 years. So that's, you know, being able to do away with you know, trash that comes off as the greenhouse cover. Oh God. Okay, great. So inside our greenhouse, you'll see our in-ground growing space. These are all 50-foot beds, as Alex mentioned before. Each one of these beds they have tomatoes growing in the center and are intercropped with various different vegetables. We have carrots, spinach, celery, and lettuce in this frame. Before the tomatoes were planted, we had other things growing in there to make sure that we had that continuation of living roots. And once some of these crops are finished and they come out, we'll be planting it with something else. So for instance, the lettuce we're gonna grow ginger where the lettuce is now, and then we'll be planting some basil after spinach and marigolds for pollinators and things like that. We also make it a point in our greenhouse, which of course it's not getting any natural rain. So before the tomatoes are planted in here, we have a sprinkler line in here, and we try to really get a good drench on the soil. And of course, soil life, it needs moisture. And so it's really important for us that, you know, every part of the soil gets, you know, a good amount of moisture. And then you can't really see it that well, but each path has ramial wood chips, and that is there to sort of retain the moisture. And we have 3 drip tapes running down every bed so that it covers the bed fully, and some of it will seep through into the paths. And so it's really important for us that, you know, all the soil, every part of the soil has some moisture. During the winter in the years past, we've put a tarp over this area once the final crop came out. But this year we plan to have something living in there throughout the winter, and then we'll be you know, moving to our cash crops in the spring. Let's see, let's move on. You'll see in the front that we have the propagation space with seedlings at different stages. And then we'll be moving out. So that's just our cold frame tables. That's where our plants get acclimated to, is that a word? Acclimated. Acclimated to the outside sun and wind and the rain. And also you'll notice that all of our fields are surrounded by landscape fabric, and that's something that we are planning to remove completely next season. We're really excited about that. It really helped us to start our farm, to keep the weeds down, to not have to spend time managing it. But we've come to a point where we can put down, either a living mulch or, you know, wood, a natural mulch like wood chips. We just want to do away with non-natural materials as much as possible. So that also, even putting wood chips down would be feeding the soil. So that's where we'll be moving towards.
So we're coming up to our first field. This is field A, the first of our original 3 fields. And underneath all the row cover, this is our direct seeded block for the spring. Lots of arugula and turnips and radishes. We plant into those using the Jang seeder. And last fall, we sowed oats and peas in all of those beds so that they winter killed, formed a nice mulch. And then in the spring, we put down a thin layer of compost over the top of them. And what we found was, and we'll talk about it a little later when we get back to the slideshow, the stock opener, the stock shoe on the Jang really needs a tilled bed or a very clean bed. Otherwise, it tends to get hung up and it'll skip and jump. So we traded that out for the double disc opener with a slight modification that we'll show later. And that has just been, for lack of better terms, a game changer because it just can cut right through any debris that's on the bed and singulate the seeds well. And we've just been really happy with that. On the right, you'll see the clear plastic that's down. That was a block of rye, of winter rye that we planted. You can see some in the background too. And we mowed that down and then we're solarizing it with the clear plastic. That's an idea we got from Brian O'Hara. It allows it, the solarization when it's warm out only takes a short amount of time, a few days for rye, less time for other crops, but rye is pretty hardy. And it allows us to minimize the time that there are no living roots in the soil. Like we said earlier, it's really important to keep that economy going, to keep the soil fed. So the least amount of time that we can not have living plant matter in the soil, the better. This is going to be a test to see if the Jang with the double disc will be able to cut through that residue. We're hoping that it will. This is the first time that we've tried it though. Last fall was the first time we tried winter rye. But we're excited to see how it goes in just a couple of days. These will be direct seeded with carrots. And then from here, we'll move on slightly and we'll get to our garlic patch. This year we planted seed garlic from 3 different sources, one of which was seed garlic that we saved from last year. That's the first time we've done that. And something really interesting that we found is that the seed garlic that we provided has been more vigorous, looks better, is much bigger than the other seed garlic that we used. So that's really encouraging. And our thought is that that garlic is already used to our soil, and so that it's adapted to it, even in just one season. So going forward, we really intend to save all of our own seed garlic, and hopefully our garlic crop will get bigger and better every single year. It's been a really encouraging thing to see. And then next to it, it's hard to see because of the contrast with the mulch, but this is our onion block. We planted this with a paper pot transplanter that we brought back from Japan last year. We had really high hopes for the paper pot. We still think it's a great tool, but in our system where we have a lot of residue, we're doing cover crops, not always or ever having a perfect seed bed, it's kind of a nightmare. It doesn't do well in those circumstances, kind of like the stock opener for the Jang. It's a wonderful tool. It's just not really practical in the direction that we're moving. You can see some of the paper chains are exposed a little bit. It's just tough to get it to be really consistent. So if anyone is looking for a paper pot transplanter, we might have one for sale. But we're kind of moving in the direction too, if anyone has heard of Singing Frogs Farm, they're a really established, influential no-till farm out of California. And their whole thing is that they plant big transplants. They just get the plants nice and healthy. They're able to fend off disease and pests. The thing about the paper pot is you're confined to these tiny little paper cells, and you have to plant them when the plants are very, very young, because otherwise the roots will all bind together and it'll never work. And we don't like that pressure and having to plant such young, tender plants.
Okay, now we're walking towards field B. This is our summer intercrop block. So you'll see eggplants in the forefront and peppers next to it. We will be doing some intercrops, I think, intercropping with scallions, but I think the Solanaceae crops are a huge opportunity to do intercropping, and we kind of didn't have the, I don't know, time to plan for that this year. So they're kind of single rows, but there's a big opportunity there that we'd like to take up to next year. And these eggplants are going to be trellised and pruned. So you can kind of see the trellis line in the background. So it's going to be a similar one with T-posts. And oh, we're really excited to save seeds of one of our heirloom eggplants. And so, yeah, we're really excited about that. Oh. So eggplants and then peppers. And then next to the peppers, we just transplanted today some okra intercropped with ginger. We'll see how that goes. And then next to that, you'll kind of see a few popping up, but these are our potato beds. So we do, quote unquote, do no-till on potatoes. We used to plant them deeper in the past in order for, to prevent the potatoes from being exposed and turning green. So, and we never hilled in the past. And we would get decent harvests of potatoes, but this year, since we have access to quite a bit of mulch, what we're gonna do is periodically mulch in order to, and that will be kind of like a hilling in place of hilling. So we'll see how that goes. We'll hopefully have an update for you later in the season. Some more scallions, rye, and we have some perennial chives. And then this last bed is supposed to be sown in buckwheat, but we haven't had the time to do that yet.
All right, so this is field C. So this is the last of our original fields. That was how big our farm was our first year. We have a bed of oats and peas there at the start, and then we move into our cucurbit block. We're going to be trellising and pruning the cucumbers this year. In years past, we might have 4 successions of cucumbers that we're picking from at the same time, and it just gets kind of overwhelming. At the beginning, the quality of the fruit is very high, and then as the plant gets older and bigger, it can decline a little bit and be more susceptible to pests. So we're taking some cues from some Japanese farmers. They will really prune back the plants, focus on the first several, maybe dozen or so or more fruit sets, and then they'll actually terminate the plant. And we're excited about that. So that we aren't picking from so many successions at once, and we're just focusing on quality. Next to that, next to those, we are intercropping nasturtiums. We've had problems with cucumber beetles in the past, and nasturtiums are supposed to be a folk remedy for that. We did it last year. It did absolutely nothing, but they look pretty. They bring in pollinators, and they work well. They have a vining habit, so they can grow up the trellis as well. Next to that, we have our zucchini. And then we have a 100-foot bed of Swiss chard and kale in the back. And in the center of that, before we put those in, we actually direct seeded parsley. So the idea, we took that idea from Frith Farm, which is another one of our farm heroes, an amazing no-till farm up in Maine. And he does that because mycorrhizal fungi, that is the fungi that forms relationships with plant roots, does not form relationships with chenopods, which Swiss chard, spinach, those are members of, and brassicas, which kale is a member of. So by putting in the parsley, we're providing plant roots that can form those associations, and they're keeping that life in the soil so that once this planting is finished and we turn it into something else, that mycorrhizal fungi is already there, it's already established. Moving on, we have some winter rye. It's getting quite tall, and that'll be mowed down and solarized. We'll talk about that a little later. Some more blocks of oats and peas. Then we have some celeriac with a line of basil down the center. And next to that, we have some shungiku, which is Japanese chrysanthemum greens. And that was supposed to be intercropped with burdock, But unfortunately, with the cold spring, the burdock didn't germinate, and we don't think it's going to. So we're actually going to plant some lettuce there along the shoulders of the Shingiku as a backup. We'll just look to the left here. This is looking north. You'll see some barn swallows flying around. This year we've having tons and tons of birds, bluebirds, barn swallows, robins, cowbirds. It's been really great to see, just eating lots of insects and having a great time.
Okay, so now we're coming to our early greens field. We have Asian greens at the front and some lettuce there beyond that. So our Asian greens, we sow and plant every week. Here in this frame, you can see some bok choy, some Tokyo Bekana, Komatsuna Mizuna, and the lettuce we sow bi-weekly in the spring and then weekly in the summer. And these two crops are great to put together because they follow one another. So if there's a lettuce planting to be done, it's usually where an Asian green just came out. And then vice versa. Both crops are, we grow so much of it and so frequently that it works really well. And given they're in different families, it's a nice sort of rotation. So it's a good combination to have. And to your right, we have the first block of oats and peas that we sowed on March 28th. It was really cold, so it took a while for them to get established, but they're nice and lush now. These beds are going to be turned into fall carrots, and I think one of the beds in sweet potatoes. You also see carrots that were sown also on the same day, March 28th, and given the really hard spring, their germination's kind of spotty. And
so what you're seeing now at the top of the screen is a big block of winter rye. It's approaching 5 feet tall. It's quite sizable. This is going to turn into our late brassica planting. So there's quite a bit of time before we have to get into this field. So we're going to play around. We already talked about the solarization that we saw over in field A. Another technique that we might try to use is what Frith Farm does, which is they just push all the rye down, not really crimping it, just flattening it in one direction, and then they drag a silage tarp onto it, leave it for a few weeks in the heat of the summer, and then when they peel it off, they've got a nice mulch that's just laid down, and then you can just kind of separate it and plant right into it. And the other way that we're thinking about doing it, which is a little scarier to think about, but looking at the rye's biology and waiting until the right point, when they think that they're forming their seeds, you can mow it down or crimp it, maybe just using a 2x4 with a piece of angle iron on the bottom. And as long as the rye thinks that it's already produced its seed, you can kind of trick it and it's not going to regrow. So that's a way that we might be able to kill the later rye crops without having to use any plastic at all. So we're excited to try that out this year. And then we'll sweep over in field F and we'll see our Fabaceae planting. We grow several successions of edamame. So on the right next to the plastic there is edamame with carrots on the shoulders. And then we have pole beans in the bed next to it with also carrots on the shoulders. And there's another block of rye there that's being solarized currently. And then in the trellises here, we have peas and they're intercropped with beets on the shoulders. Trellising has been a challenge for us for these past couple of seasons. We like the one on the left. It's basically a 5-foot fence roll being held onto T-posts with electric fence insulators. That's really firm, steady, sturdy, and the peas can climb it very well. On the right is a conduit. We got this idea from Josh Satin. If you've ever seen his YouTube channel, it's awesome. Lots of great tips. So we're running Horta Nova on that, and we'll probably use that trellising method for a bunch of different things. But trellising at this scale can be tough, and we haven't really mastered it yet. So it's an ongoing struggle. And in a second, we'll look over to the left, and you get a better look at that massive rye. It's pretty soon we're going to lose Yoko in it. It's almost as tall as her. And we'll take a look back to the barn, and you'll see the porch. So under that is where our wash station is. And then right inside is our walk-in cooler. You can see our market van over there. And then we'll come back on the other side of the greenhouse, and we'll get into our last field, which is field F.
So field F is where our early brassicas are planted. I don't know if you'll be able to tell. The first bed has artichokes growing in the center row, and on the shoulders we have kohlrabi. The artichokes are now sort of stretching out to try to get more of that sunlight, and it's looking great so far. So yeah, we'll see how that combination goes. And then next to that are successions of cabbages and Napa cabbage. We have some broccolini. Next to it, we have Asian greens that are just about to be harvested because they're, flowering, so they really need to be harvested. Underneath the shade cloth, we have lettuce that we just planted a few days ago. We had a couple of days of really hot, above 80, full sunny days. So this shade cloth is great for the initial stages of the lettuce. We'll be taking it off within 2 weeks of it being planted in the ground, and so to prevent them from stretching out. And you'll see the broccolinis are all different shapes. Shapes and sizes, because our favorite Happy Rich is not offered anymore. So we're trialing a bunch of different broccolini varieties, and we'll see how that goes, but they all grow very differently. And then we're going to conclude our virtual tour with these carrot beds. The last bed here is intercrop with scallions, and these also have a thin layer of fine mulch on it. So that's where the color comes from. Is that it?
Yep. Stop sharing. Now we'll go back to the slideshow and
we're gonna
talk about more of the logistics of how we actually do things.
Is that it? Oh.
Stop.
Oh, stop share.
And then
Don't I share? Oh yeah. Okay, so we're going back to the slides. So we'll do a deep dive into cover crops, and I just want to preface it by saying we are not experts on cover crops. We just started oats and peas last year, and this is the first time we're overwintering rye, so take it with a grain of salt. And we're doing buckwheat and crimson clover this year. The buckwheat, basically any time window that we have of about 5 weeks or so, I think we're going to sow in the summer. And then crimson clover, our plan is to undersow it in our late brassica beds, so that it'll start growing while we're still harvesting from those late brassica crops. Okay. So almost every bed is in cover crops at some point during the season, which is intentional. And during the winter, we expect to have about half of our fields in cover crop and the rest of it mulched. And so we really want to move away from using any kind of silage tarps. If you've used it before, you know how difficult it is to keep it down. So we're excited about that. And we're definitely really excited to try different cover crops and combinations. Frith Farm does so much cover crop cocktails, and it's just, it's very interesting, and we like to do a lot of experimental stuff with other types of cover crops too.
So just a couple of quick slides about the logistics of our cover crop sowing. We do oats and peas in the spring and in the fall. And we've been using the earthway seeder to do it. It's not the best at singulating seed, but for cover crops, that's not a problem at all. For the oats, we use the Swiss chard and beet roller, and for the peas, we use the large pea roller. There's 2 different size pea rollers that it comes with. And we soak the peas and inoculate them first. When we were looking up how to do this, a lot of people said you couldn't soak them first, that they would get jammed, but we haven't had that experience. It helps with germination. It helps to get that inoculum in them. So it's been working out really well. The only tip I can give is sometimes the chaff or broken seeds, they can get behind the seed plate. So before I put the seed plate in, I just brush on a little bit of vegetable oil, and it just keeps it lubricated and working just fine. When we do this, we typically do 4 rows of peas and 3 rows of oats. We've also played around with 3 rows of peas and 2 rows of oats. They tend to fill up the bed just the same. On the field walk that we showed in that big oats and pea planting, there was some of each, and they end up looking the same. But for the roots, the root mass, we just feel like it's better to have more. So we go with 4 and 3 now. And it's great because the pea tendrils we actually sell at our market, and people love them. So we're feeding our soil, we're feeding our customers. It's a win-win for everybody involved. So in order to prep the beds, once we've had a cover crop in, if it's winter killed, you can ignore the first 2 points. It just lays down a nice mulch. We might put a little bit of compost on top of it, and away we go. If it's in the summer, we've seeded them in the spring, then we'll mow and solarize them. And then points 3, 4, and 5, you'll see on the next few slides. Those in parentheses because we don't necessarily do them every time. Adding minerals might just happen once a year. Adding nutrients might just happen once a year. Broad forking might depend on what's going in next, and we might end up moving away from broad forking completely. Same with compost, we're putting down less and less as time goes on. And just for reference, planting, TP is transplant, DS is direct seeding. So I talked about the Jang and the double disc opener. If you look at the image on the right, you can see the double disc opener outfitted. It comes direct from the company, it fits right in. It just has these little metal wings on the side, on those bolts on the side of each disc. And I'm not really sure what the intended purpose of those were, but for us, if you're seeding into debris, all they seem to do is collect all the debris and then stop the discs. So we just took those off, and now it just glides through, and we haven't had a problem with it at all. So that's been a great, just easy modification. And like I said, we're gonna try going into rye with it, and hopefully I have a feeling it's gonna cut right through that as well. So speaking of rye, rye we sow in the fall, and we'll either terminate it in the spring, or we'll let it get bigger and then terminate it in the summer and plant right into it. So for the spring termination, we will, well, before I get into that, we believe that the seed plate is the L24. It might also be the LJ24. It's been a while since we seeded it. Both of them seem to accommodate the seed. So I think we use the L24. The LJ is a little bit bigger, so it might put it down more densely. But we do 10 to 12 rows on a 30-inch bed. So in the spring, if we need to get into a rye crop, it's just been holding the biology in the soil over the winter. We'll just go ahead and put a silage tarp over it. Depending on the temperature, the size of the rye, it's going to take 1 to 3 weeks to kill it. And in the top right, you'll see what it looks like when we peel that off. Not a lot of biomass, but the roots are in there. And like I said, it's been holding on to the life, which is the primary purpose of that planting. It's a little too cool in the spring to use solarization, so that's the way we terminate it. If it's going to be, if we're letting it grow to maturity or close to maturity, then we'll solarize it like we've shown you. So we'll flail mow it, we'll solarize it. The next slide will actually show you those steps. And then once we do that, we'll transplant into it ideally. We might have to use a trowel or another tool just to kind of get through the roots, because the root mat is insane if you've let it grow for that long. But we've also seen some farmers use like an earth auger attached to a drill, which is an interesting idea if you're doing tomatoes or something that needs to be planted deep. So this picture shows the 3 steps of solarization. We use our flail mower attached to our Grillo walk-behind tractor. That does a good job of chopping it down really fine. Then we'll take some greenhouse plastic we got from our friends at the Connecticut Greenhouse Company. We'll give Toby a shout out. If you need a greenhouse, call him up. And then on the right, that's after a couple of days of nice, sunny, warm weather. It really just cooks the rye, turns it into a nice mulch, and we can plant right into that.
So I'll talk a little bit about bed prep. So this is when we're turning over a cash crop into another cash crop or a cover crop. Direct sown crops, in our case, is only arugula, is usually mowed depending on its size and solarized, just like we do with oats and peas or rye. Transplanted crops are either mowed or cut at the soil surface. This part is important. You want to make sure that the roots are intact in the soil. They've already formed their relationship with the microbiology, so we want to disturb it as minimally as possible. And so it's either mowed or cut at the soil surface and then all of it removed. We are excited to mow more crops this year because we imagine that once we mow it, all that debris would just fall to the bed and kind of act as a mulch and just kind of be composting on top of our beds. And if we're direct seeding with the Jang, then we'll, and there's a heavy mulch on the bed, we'll simply rake aside the mulch, sow into it, and then put it back on, or put it back on once they germinate. So what Alex mentioned earlier, we are broad forking less and less. We do use it, we try to use it before root crops. And also we just kind of feel the bed and see if it needs it. Most of the time our beds are really loose now, so it doesn't really need it. And so, yeah, we'll see how often we use this in the future. And then once per season, we put down some compost. This year we're doing about 100 shovelfuls per 100-foot bed. We imagine we'll use less and less in the future. We also put down nutrients, a mix of slow and fast release nutrients, just once at the beginning of the season. You know, we put compost down, and depending on where your compost comes from too and how long it's been on, you know, there's a lot of nitrogen that's going to be accessible, especially during the warmer months. So, you know, taking that into account, you know, we don't see a need to put in a bunch of nutrients. And hopefully in the future we do more soil tests frequently, so that we know exactly how much we're putting down or how much we need to put down or putting too much. And then finally we are putting mulch down just once before when we're prepping the bed for the first time. But we'll see how long this mulch sticks around, because we haven't, you know, used this mulch before. So depending on how quickly it decomposes, we might add to it. So this is what it looks like in pictures. The compost, you know, in the left photo, we put it down right on top of that winter killed oats and peas, and it's totally fine. You just rake it out. And you can see Alex using a bucket to put down some wood chips on the pads. And then the far right photo is just putting some fertilizer down and then lightly raking it so that it's applied a little more evenly. So for soil coverage, if we can't have living roots in the soil, then we'll have our salt marsh hay mulch on our beds. So we surprisingly had a foresight to buy this Caravaggio chipper shredder attachment on our Grillo when we first bought our tractor. We do use it for ramial wood chips, but we are using it basically for this mulching like 99% of the time now. And I do two types of mulches. So for something like carrots that, you know, are really tiny and delicate, I do a fine chop. So I get to kind of sprinkle it across the bed. You'll see that in the picture with the onions on the bottom center. And then for everything else, I do a rough chop, which it goes really quick with the chipper shredder. I can do about 4 bales of hay in about 40 minutes. And that covers quite a bit of space, probably up to about 8 beds maybe for 4 bales. So about 2 beds per bale of hay. And this Vermont compost potting mix sling bag is kind of convenient to put away some mulch that you don't need right away. And that fits about 3 bales of hay. So with the mulching, I just want to emphasize that we're not mulching to suppress weeds. You can see in this picture, I've never weeded this field, and it's it's really basically, we put it on there because it protects the soil from erosion, and it also feeds the microbes on the surface of the beds. So that's the purpose behind it. Some crops we put a heavy layer of mulch if it's like potatoes or something that's really long season, but otherwise it's kind of just to cover the bed, so it's not exposed. And then for direct sown beds like arugula and radishes, we don't mulch them because they grow really quickly and fill out the bed really quickly. And I think that's it.
Okay, so we've talked about most of this stuff, but we'll just run through it quick again. You know, having living roots in the bed is obviously really important to us. That's what's feeding the soil. Having photosynthesis occurring, it's pumping carbon, it's pumping sugars into the ground, and then the mycelium that's present is distributing that and making associations. So we just want to make sure that there's not too much time without living roots in a bed. The idea behind putting 2 or more families of crops is that you get a more diverse microbial population. Besides plants that don't form relationships with mycorrhizal fungi, you'll also find that maybe some bacteria prefer to associate with one family of plants and not another. So by having multiple families represented, you're really increasing the soil biology. And that's yeah, we've covered a lot of that and can answer some questions about it. For nutrient application and inoculation, we are starting to explore fertigation this year. Something that is maybe a challenge with no-till is getting minerals and nutrients to move throughout the soil column. If you're not tilling it, they can just kind of stratify depending on what it is and stay at the surface, or, you know, eventually the soil biology is going to move that around. But if you can dissolve it in water and then put it on that way, you'll get it to move through the soil column to the root zone much more efficiently. So we bought this hose reel this year, which is awesome. We can spool 100 feet onto it, just bring it out to a bed, hook it to our frost-free hydrant, and then we can water in transplants really fully and deeply. In that picture, you can see the white bucket with a little black hose running to it. That's a little hose-on siphon. It mixes nutrients at a 16:1 ratio with the water going in, just plugs right in, screws into a garden hose. So by doing that, we can add nutrients, minerals, inoculants. Doing that with something like garlic, which is a pretty heavy feeder, we can see the results almost instantaneously. If they have a little yellow on their tips, we feed it, and we usually use fish or something like that. And the next day they're green and full again. We will say that before we transplant, we tend to dip the transplant trays into a fish mixture, and Yoko has also been adding broad spectrum inoculum into it for bacterial and fungal colonies. So besides doing this later on, we also do that initially. And we're also looking at this for using compost tea and foliar applications. The spray with the pressure will go about maybe 3 or 4 beds. So we can go down and cover almost half a field in one go, which is just fantastic. It's an awesome tool.
So we have been focusing more on mineralization this season, especially, you know, here in the Northeast, we have relatively sandy soils, and with heavy rainfall, we're, you know, on an annual basis losing minerals. So we think it's important to address some deficiencies in trace minerals. So this year we're adding really small amounts of manganese, zinc, boron, and copper. And how we do that is we, you know, put our PPEs on and we measure out the really small amounts of these trace elements, and we put it in a watering can and dissolve it and have it applied on a 50-foot bed section at a time. And that allows us to do it very evenly, unless it's really windy. That's a nightmare. And in terms of macronutrients, we're adding gypsum and potassium sulfate this year to balance nutrients. We did put quite a bit of dolomitic lime initially when we started, because our pH was so low, and that kind of threw our calcium, magnesium levels kind of out of whack. So this is a way of addressing it.
So we'll quickly talk about some of the pests that we've encountered. Some might be more prone to no-till systems. Some you probably have seen before. Ants are our #1 pest in the spring and fall. Some people don't believe us when we say that, although we recently did a social media post and a lot of farmers said that they have the same problem. I think here in New England with the sandy soil, ants are just ubiquitous, and they are one of the first insects to wake up. There's not a lot to eat, and they just go after the sugars that these young transplants are producing. So on the top right picture, in the red circle, you can see just a whole bunch of ants, and what they'll do is eat all of the tissue around the plant, effectively girdling it, and that plant will die. We've lost plantings before. We fight with them every year. They're really destructive, and they are much smarter than you think they are. So we're still looking for ways to combat them in an organic manner. On the bottom right, you can also see sometimes they'll just do little exploratory bites, and it'll make the produce, it'll still grow on the root crops, but maybe not that sellable, make ugly yellow lesions on them. So we typically will just eat a lot of that stuff and not take it to market. Wireworms are a big problem too. They're a typical pest in sod. Maybe because we only broke our fields a few years ago and we're surrounded by an old hayfield. Maybe that's why we're seeing a lot of them. Hopefully we'll see them drop off. They're the larvae of click beetles. They live in the soil for years, quite a few years, I think up to 7. And they will go after the roots of young transplants. So this year they took out a lot of our onions. We would pull up an onion plant. There would be 4 or 5 feeding on a single cluster of onions. They also go after lettuce. They can be very destructive. I already touched on cucumber beetles. We've had problems with them in the past. The main problem with them is they're a vector for bacterial wilt. So even if you can take out 99% of the population, if there's one beetle that has that disease, it'll just decimate your cucumber crops. We've also had an instance where we had 50 feet of cucumbers in the greenhouse, and they actually ate the plants down to the ground. Like you couldn't even tell that there were ever cucumbers there to begin with. And the last major pest we have, they show up in the fall, is oriental beetle larvae, big white grubs. We'll see the beetles earlier in the summer. They don't really harm anything. They just mate, and then we'll come out and notice that a whole bunch of our lettuce is wilting. And when you pull them up, again, like the wireworms, you'll find 4 or 5 grubs feeding on the roots. So these are our main pests. And yeah. So for future plans and dreams, we want to set up pollinator habitats and hedgerows all around our field. Last year we tarped some areas, and now we're working with NRCS to get a grant to put up hedgerows. Really looking forward to that. Hopefully grow some edible trees, elderberries, hazelnuts, things like that. Yoko already talked about how we want to replace all the landscape fabric with living pathways or mulch. We obviously are going to use clear plastic and maybe some silage tarps in the future, but we're trying to eliminate as much plastic from our operation as possible. We want to build a compost station and start making our own compost so that we can customize the amendments. If you ever get a chance to go see Brian O'Hara, we'll give him another plug. He makes his own compost. He's a wizard. He's awesome. We've gotten compost from several companies in New England, and some have been better, even much better than others, but we've never truly been, happy with what we've gotten. We really want to get into saving seeds. That's something, like I mentioned, that Japanese farmers are very adept at. The organic seed movement is not quite happening in Japan right now. So a lot of farmers just do it out of necessity. And what we find is seeds that we bring back from Japan, from our friends, they outperform the seeds that we get from seed companies here in the States. If you're a farmer and you are breeding your own plants, you can just really focus on the qualities that you want, not just size, but flavor and shape and color and all these different things. Leaves are a huge benefit here in New England, where we have lots of deciduous trees. we want to start using more leaves. Unfortunately, the waste stream is so polluted that we can't really rely on getting leaves that anyone else has picked up, whether it's the town that goes around and collects them in the fall or a landscaping company. You know, they suck up things that aren't leaves, plastic trash, stuff like that. And lastly, we're toying with the idea of making our own potting mix because why not? And that pretty much concludes the presentation. So
We'll stop sharing.
yeah, we'll stop sharing, and we wanted to see if anyone had any questions, and we'll try to talk about them.
All right. Thank you so much. That was as exciting as I thought it was going to be, and we are right at the limit of our participants, around 100 people. So, hi again. So, I am doing my best. I think the next on our timeline, the next sort of item is to go and have what I think we anticipated to be a casual half hour of questions, but judging by the chat screen and my sore hand from trying to categorize them all, this is not going to be casual. You have a lot of questions to answer in the next half hour.
Let's do a lightning round.
Buckle up. What I have tried to do is categorize them or code them a little bit into buckets of questions. So I'll start with sort of a beginner level question and then move through questions about sort of generalist questions about tillage reduction, some business questions, and then more specifically around crop decisions, weed decisions, fertility decisions, and pest and disease. So those are our buckets. They'll start with the sort of beginning generalist question, and as I've been watching the participants go up, the number of people going up and down, it means a lot of farmers, I imagine, are finishing their day and checking in late. So some of these may have been answered in the beginning of your presentation. But the first question is, for a beginning farmer or if someone who is new to tillage and no-till planting, where might you begin? In your first year, do you in fact break ground to make these beds? Or is it no-till from point zero onward?
So yeah, we actually have a slide about that. But maybe we don't have time. When we first broke our fields, just because of the nature of them, it was a over century-old hay field with really deep perennial root mats. We decided to till. So we had a rotary plow that fit on the back of our walk-behind tractor. Rather than pulverizing the soil like a rototiller does, it spins kind of like an auger. So instead of crushing it, it's just kind of inverting it, flipping it over. It helps to break through that root mat. There is something to be said for that, for tilling. It helps to incorporate things like lime throughout the soil column rather than just putting it on the surface. It also allows you to find all the rocks, not all of them. They keep coming up every year, but it helps us to rock pick. And yeah, cut through that root mat. So I don't think there's any problem with tilling and then moving into a no-till system. There might be a lot of benefits to that.
But there's definitely ways to not till at all. I know Josh Satin just started at his new place, and I mean, in this case, you might need a lot of help, but what he did was just, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the lasagna sort of cardboard style.
Sheet composting.
So basically, the cardboard lets you suppress all the perennial weeds, and then you just, you layer on compost and mulch and more compost and mulch, and you cut a hole through the cardboard and plant into it. And so essentially you're like allowing the soil to decompose and become this future bed without tilling at all. So depending on what size you are, what resources you have access to, what kind of labor you have access to, I think there's different ways to do it, but it really depends on that, how you open it up.
You can also use silage tarps and just occultate. We did that for a while too. You can do that for a whole season and just kill off the existing sod, and then you can plant right into that.
One other question that again is sort of a generalist question is, and I can add to this as well, you guys are so young and you are so well versed in all of this. What are the best resources that you have used? Where did you learn about intercropping? What are the top books and resources? How did you get this smart this fast?
So when we started our farm, we spent, well, we bought it in 2016 and our first season wasn't until 2018. So in that time frame, we made sure to visit as many farms as possible. I think the greatest resources are just other farmers, people who have been doing it a long time. There's as many ways to farm as there are farmers. So it's not about copying somebody's system. We just went out and from everything from a wash station to how to break ground to cover cropping, everything, just kind of seeing what makes sense, what clicks. But definitely there are some really influential no-till farms that we follow and that we you know, we'd be lucky to grow at their level. Frith Farm in Maine, Woven Roots Farm in Western Massachusetts, Tobacco Road Farm here in Connecticut, Singing Frogs Farm in California. You can also, there's a podcast called the No-Till Market Garden Podcast. That's what it's called, right?
Yeah.
I just gotta make sure. Shout out to Jesse if he's listening. We were on that podcast. Go and listen to all those episodes. Just seek out farmers and I think that's the.
I think social media is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, just looking at Instagram accounts of all these farms, we're just constantly, our practice is constantly evolving. So that's why it's interesting to have talks and be involved in, you know, these kind of things, because 2 weeks later you ask us and we've totally changed our minds. But
Yeah, we were on that podcast last year and everything we just talked about, we weren't really doing last year. So we've totally evolved, you know, it's crazy. And we'll probably be a little different next year and it's just constant evolution.
Yeah. At this moment in time, how would you categorize your sort of biggest benefit in your own estimation from the no-till system that you've created, and also your biggest frustration?
Well, with the benefit, it's really hard to know exactly what's a result of no-till, but of course, what we talked about, you know, just our great tasting vegetables, how long it lasts, all these things, you know, we don't have too many pests, I don't think. So I think all those things are connected to no-till, but one thing we know for sure that is from no-till is that there are no weeds because of no-till. And I forgot to mention, our first 2 years, we had some weeds. We didn't have a ton, but especially in June when all the weeds come up, I did do some weeding. This year, there's so few that the fact that we don't have to spend time weeding allows us to be just a two-person team and produce the amount of food that we're producing. So that's huge.
Yep. Jumping from going into the weeding bucket now, when do you decide about solarizing versus a silage tarp? How do you make that decision? And do you ever worry about overheating in the soil or things like that?
It's mostly based on the time of year. So it's really, you need to have, you know, 75 degrees plus and sun to solarize. So if it's happening in the spring or in the fall, we're going to go with a silage tarp because you're really just wanting to block out the light. As far as the overheating in the soil, this is something that we've heard farmers talk about. Brian O'Hara has talked about it. Soil is pretty well insulated. So, and the plastic isn't sitting directly on the bed. It's sitting on the mulch or on the you know, the debris that's being formed from mowing or laying it down. So I think that what he said was, if you measure the temperature change an inch into the soil, it is not that great. And the amount of time that you're leaving that, that cover on is very brief. So our thought is that the biology is probably just going to move a little lower when it gets hotter, like some of the pests do. And then once we take it off, put roots back into it, it's coming back up. So we're not too worried about that. But as far as which to use, it's just time of year, temperature.
Have you faced any of the perennial weeds like mugwort or things that spread by rhizomes?
Oh yeah, we had bindweed all over the ends of our fields, but we were able to take that out pretty easily. What we did was, you just have to be really persistent. And I found that you have to do it at least twice a week, pull out all of them. And you continue that for at least 3 weeks, 3-4 weeks. And of course, throughout the season, but really like intensely those first, month or so. And we barely see any bindweed now, so.
That's something that's nice about being on our scale too, is that every day we can walk around the entire farm. It doesn't take that long. So, they say that the best fertilizer is a farmer's footsteps, because you're walking around and you're seeing everything every single day. So if we have a patch of bindweed, we can go and check it every day, and we can pull it out every day, and it just beats it down eventually.
Yeah.
But yeah, bindweed, we have spurge, which is horrible. I don't know if anyone else has that.
We actually have some poison ivy
Poison
too.
ivy.
And that, yeah, it's annoying because you have to come out with a wrench and like
or
pull it
gloves or
out.
whatever. But yeah, the perennial weeds can be, especially the rhizomous ones are.
Oh, we also have horse nettle, which is one of the worst ones. Yeah, they can stay in the ground for years.
Moving into the cover cropping slides, one of the questions that came up was, are your seeding rates any higher or lower since you are using a no-till system or for the cover crops that we saw? And following on to that, have you used any of the tillage radish or things like that in your cover crop mix?
We haven't used tillage radish. All we've used is what we had in the slides. But like we said, Frith Farm, they do a cocktail of like 13 different cover crops in a single bed. So we definitely want to move towards that. We were a little scared of doing rye on our scale. It's very vigorous, so we want to make sure that we can manage things like that before we start adding more into the mix. The other thing about seeding rates, honestly, we don't really pay that much attention to the seeding rates of the cover crops, not like we do. Like when we're doing cash crops, we'll weigh out the seed before and after, make sure the seed plate's clean. We'll really identify that. But using the earthway, we just fill up the hopper. We get big 50-pound bags of seed, and we just want to make it as dense as possible, put in as much as possible. So as I'm seeding it, I'm just watching the hopper and making sure that it's dropping seed, maybe looking behind it and making sure it's going in at a good rate. But it's more just by feel. It's not really something that we quantify or pay that much attention to. So we've been really happy with the rates just using the stock earthway.
Okay. Then questions digging deeper into the soil are around fungal life and nutrient additions. Gosh, there are a bunch of them. First, for mycelial life, you mentioned that you employ inoculants. Are there other ways that you promote fungal life in your soil?
I mean, I feel like just by not tilling, you're creating a place for them. So, as long as you keep, like this spring in the greenhouse, we probably had 7 or 8 different species of fungal growth that were happening simultaneously in all the beds. It was
and those
a huge
are,
bloom.
those are the ones that actually produce mushrooms.
But yeah.
Most most of the fungal species out there in our field do not produce mushrooms. So who knows how many.
Yeah. So, just through the practice of no-till, you're not breaking up those fungal networks. So the native biology is here. It was here before, and we just let it be.
I mean, we would love to do stuff like the Brian O'Hara's indigenous
IMO.
Yeah, IMO. So bringing in microbial culture from the woods nearby and things like that. There's actually practices like that in Japan that we've been able to observe and learn about. So we're interested in things like that. But for now, we take things slowly because there's just too many things we want to do every year. So right now, we're planning to do compost teas, and I think we're about to apply some EM1 and just kind of like broad spectrum ones that just to like increase the diversity as much as possible. Yeah.
Do you consider the crop that you are growing as you try to manage the fungal and bacterial relationships in each bed or each block?
No. Oh, the question was if we manage the ratios?
Yeah. How does the fungal and bacterial balance differ or shift depending on what you're growing?
Oh, I mean, right now we plan to buy a microscope for sure, but we haven't done that yet. So we, we're not looking at each bed and seeing what the ratio is and stuff like that. So that's definitely something that we're interested in, but we haven't been able to realize. But we're not going to be managing fungal to bacteria ratio like bed by bed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have 1 or 2 crops in each bed every year, and it's just,
yeah, I think just creating a holistic system. So like getting rid of that landscape fabric, we don't like that because it's kind of like a little dead zone. It's not really, but there's worms and macro biology going on. But putting wood chips in the pathways, using the cover crops, keeping life in the soil year round. I think that things just, if you create those systems, you'll find that those things will come in from, we're surrounded by forests and rivers. It's, there's biology here and we just need to invite it in,
Yeah.
One last soil question. You mentioned that you're moving away from using compost in the future. Can you explain more about why that is?
We're already at about 10% organic matter. I don't think it's necessarily that we need volumes of organic matter or compost. It's like certain things, certain nutrients and whatnot that we need. So, with applying nutrients, it's always better to add it to compost first, because then it gets assimilated into that compost and becomes readily available to the plants when you apply to them. So rather than, just like giving some fertilizer to the plants. So in that way, we want to have compost so that we are able to feed our plants through our compost. But it really doesn't need to be a large amount. We already have, a lot of organic matter, and we just don't, it's a lot of work too. So if we're not getting, more benefits from it, then it just doesn't make sense to keep doing that.
Mm-hmm. Up from the soil into some of the plants, there are some very specific questions about intercropping and crop-specific questions. I have so many. Where do I begin? Make sure I don't forget any here. Sorry, I only have 10 fingers. The first is for intercropping eggplants and peppers. What are you using there?
Last year with peppers, we did lettuce. It worked really well. 2 years ago we did that. Eggplants, we're gonna do scallions, but I think in terms of timing, we should have already had those planted probably a few weeks ago, because eggplants are gonna get large. But I mean, honestly, Solanaceae, as long as the size, you can get a crop in before they fill up the whole bed, I honestly think anything is fine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For potatoes, you mentioned that you mulch for them. Are you using salt hay for that as well? And is it purchased, or how do you source it?
It's purchased. There's a guy up in the North Shore in Massachusetts, and he comes by the trailer load, which is awesome.
And when you are, for succession planting, are you leaving roots in the ground as you move from one crop to the next? And for interplanting as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we never pull roots out unless it's a root crop. Everything else just gets cut at the soil surface and left in.
Excellent. Then we are to pests and disease. How do you handle the risk of carrying over diseases from one year into the next? How much rotation are you able to do in these 6 blocks on 3/4 of an acre?
So I actually don't believe in diseases transferring from one year to the next. We're not worried about that at all. As long as your plants are healthy and are able to access the nutrients that they need, they should be able to fend off any disease. So in our first year, we bought grafted tomato plants, and it came with powdery mildew. And we noticed it on the plants before we even transplanted it. We told the seed company, blah, 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 but we didn't have an alternative. So we planted it, and of course it was covered in powdery mildew. And we were really worried it was gonna, continue on in the second year. And it's not like you can 100% carry out every piece of leaves and whatnot you know, from the first year. So, but it didn't come back the second year. So, and I think that goes with almost anything. We're just not that worried. And so even with what is it called? Rotations, I'm not too worried about the diseases. I think the rotations are a little bit more useful for pests and just, I don't know, maybe what the plant is accessing for nutrients. So if you keep planting the same thing, it'll keep taking up the same nutrients, but I'm not too worried about disease.
Sticking on pests again, what about things like cabbage worm? We had a question about grubs, a question about flea beetle. Any of those you want to take on?
So flea beetles, last year we had it really bad on the eggplants, but that was, I feel like it was because the plants were getting really stressed in their tiny 50 cell trays. And because we've been changing the way we're heating our greenhouse every spring. So it's really hard to know how quickly these transplants are going to grow. So some of the vegetables we start way too early, and then they end up staying in their cells for way too long. And you can notice, when a plant is stressed out in a small cell, because it just starts attracting all types of pests. And so we definitely feel like the eggplants started off on the wrong foot last year. This year we potted them up in 4-inch pots, and so we don't see flea beetles on them yet. And flea beetles, they're not a huge problem for us, and we're actually considering removing all our covers from arugula and turnips and all that too, all our direct sown stuff. We've been worried in the past, but I feel like now that we're in our third year, some of the pests and insects are kind of balancing out, and that there's not like a huge outbreak of any one thing.
Yeah, we think that if you can get things in balance, if you can get soil in balance, predators and pests in balance, then we can probably get rid of the covers. One thing that we noticed last year when we had some more weeds in the field was that the pests were attacking the weeds, not necessarily the crops. So you would see the flea beetles on the lamb's quarter that was coming up, and they wouldn't be on the brassica right next to it. So I think that as we continue to improve our soil and it balances out, you see some farms that never use covers, and I think that they're just on top of their soil health, and that might take 10 years, but it's the long game. Eventually we want to get rid of all the covers. The only reason we'd use them is to maybe keep things a little warmer in the early months.
And what's his name with the pyramid? Yeah. The pyramid with the insect, how the plants have their own system.
I can't
What's his
remember.
name? I forget the name, but there's a whole science behind plants being able to, if they have access to the right nutrients, that they're not appealing to insects. Like there needs to be a certain level of like simple sugars for aphids to come and for that plant to be like appealing enough for them to eat. So I just can't remember the name of the person who came up with that pyramid, but anyway, sorry.
The last question is really about whether or not you think that the no-till system, whether there are gaps that you are now working on. So for example, are there particular pests that you think might be more unique to a no-till system versus a tillage farmer? Are there particular weeds that are of greater concern to a no-till farmer versus other farms you've seen or more highly tilled farms? What are problems that might be unique to you?
Right. I would say definitely ants, because I've never really heard of ants being a problem in bigger farms. And these farms, mostly they do till, and I feel like if you're breaking up the soil and breaking up their nests, like, of course they're not going to stick around. But for us, it's like, we're not touching the soil, so they just love building nests everywhere. And one of the reasons why we're excited to take the landscape fabric off is because I think underneath the landscape fabric is a really ideal place for them to build a nest. So we do find them underneath the fabric quite often. So we're hoping that removing that will alleviate some of that ant problem that we have.
Terrific. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. It's now just at 6:30, and we're going to try to shift our presentation a little bit. Yoko and Alex, before, if I can just ask one more thing, I have done my best to kind of go through some of this chat, but that window is there for you.
Yeah.
If you want to take a minute and scan it, or if there's anything there that you've seen that's jumped out at you that I haven't covered, you might want to speak to that. Next up, after we hear sort of a final answer or two from Yoko and Alex, if anything does grab you, then we will hear from Caro. And Monique, if you could just give me a thumbs up that Caro is in fact queued up and ready to go. Awesome. And Caro is really part of the leadership team at NOFA and is working across the 7 states, but through this CIG grant, the Conservation Innovation Grant, is working across a number of states to look at different farmers and how they are building soil health, but in particular, building soil carbon. And Yoko and Alex have focused on that for us as well, and the importance of that. Why don't we, before I go further with Caro, I see Yoko and Alex are giggling at some of the chat questions. Why don't you guys take a few of them on, just ad lib, and then we'll about shift over to Caro.
Well, we just saw the person that Yoko,
I thought
Caro
of John,
actually said it in the chat as John Kemp.
but I thought about that like a few minutes ago. I was like, it's John Kemp. So if anyone's interested, go to, he has a podcast. He does a lot of amazing stuff. He has a blog. So the whole, yeah. Just look him up.
There's somebody asked, have we had our soil tested? What lab? We use Logan Lab. This spring, Yoko really got into soil analysis, and we hired
a soil consultant. But the thing is, when you get recommendations, you get like every single recommendation is pretty different. So at the end, I just felt comfortable to kind of do my own math and come up with what I'm comfortable with. So that's what I did. And in terms of the trace minerals, where you really don't want to add too much of them, there are guidelines by the Bionutrient Association where, every year you don't want to add more than, X amount of each of these trace minerals. So if you're adding any of those trace minerals, I would definitely use, their guidelines too for not over applying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've gotten recommendations from the Yukon test, and they tell you to put in just a ridiculous amount of lime. And then you tell that to a soil scientist, and they're like, don't ever do that. Never put that much lime in.
Well, that's the thing.
So,
there's a difference between, like, if you have a deficiency, you need a timeline to make up for that deficiency, not try to do it in 1 year. And I think what the number that Yukon had was kind of like an amount that would get rid of the entire deficiency in 1 year. So not knowing that, I think we over applied and, consequently had that calcium magnesium ratio kind of off balance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly see that the most popular sentiment in this chat is thank you. People have said it many, many times throughout is, yeses and exclamation points and things. So, as we close out with you guys, I just wanted to echo that sentiment as well from all of us at CT NOFA. We're so grateful to have you with us. And this is a 3-year opportunity to follow this community of practice around tillage reduction. And so we will hear from you again, hopefully more and more in the upcoming months, and follow your season. We wish you the best of luck. And we will see Yoko and Alex again throughout the season, but we also have another field day for Massaro Community Farm that is coming up in September. And so one of the interesting things about this community around tillage reduction is that Connecticut NOFA has focused on a smaller scale production. Yoko and Alex's Assawaga Farm. We're also looking at mid-sized production, which is Steve Massaro and his team Steve Munno and his team at Massaro Community Farm. And then larger scale production included, and some of you probably joined us for our field day last year at Sub Edge Farm with Roger Phillips. So we will hear from some of these 3 farmers throughout this season as our soil technician and tillage reduction team follows these guys. Now I would love to turn it over to Caro. I will once again mute myself and dim myself. And Caro is going to be presenting to us on her carbon proxy testing, something that was really championed by the folks up at Massachusetts NOFA. And has really served as the backbone of this research in tillage reduction over the last couple of years. So again, thank you to Yoko and Alex, and Caro, over to you.
I just got a message from Caro. She says, "You can't hear me, question mark." Caro, did you try to hit your unmute button? I know that you're trying to use your computer audio. And maybe you need to phone in.
Thank you. Somebody just unmuted me.
There you go. I can hear you
Hi,
now.
thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I had to call in because I was having a little trouble with the video. Just to disclaim to everyone at the beginning of this presentation, I live in a rural part of Massachusetts with very slow internet. I only have satellite. So I'm going to be on the phone during on my landline during this call because I also don't have cell reception. So apologies in advance if there's a bit of a delay and for any technical difficulties we encounter because of my very slow internet. But I'm so excited to be here. Dina, thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Monique, for unmuting me. I'm Caro. I'm the Education Director with NOFA MASS and the Soil Carbon Program Coordinator as well. And I've had the great pleasure to work with Connecticut NOFA and several farmers in Massachusetts and also NOFA New Jersey and several of their farmers, and Yoko and Alex on this Conservation Innovation Grant project with NRCS. And as I'm sure you've heard, we are working with folks like Yoko and Alex who are really champions of healthy soils practices in organic systems to create a learning community of farmers who are innovating at different scales in that space in organic certification and tillage reduction. And do a combination of things to help those farmers strategize and plan with each other to expose each other to new approaches. So can some of the folks who are doing a little bit larger scale tillage reduction that's mechanized learn from Yoko and Alex with some of their methods to implement on their farms. So we have cross-farmer learning, peer-to-peer learning, and then those same farmers become teachers like we saw today with Yoko and Alex in their fantastic presentation for other farmers and the farming community and the food systems community. So there's lots of project activities related to this project at our conferences and our field days. And today we have a remote version of one of those field days. So I'm looking forward to talking with you a little bit about the soil health assessment side of our work. As part of this project, we are tracking quantifiable soil health indicators throughout the 3 years on those farms to see what we can learn about their practices. And the methodology we're using to do that quantified soil health assessment tracking is our carbon proxy tests. And what I'm going to go over with you today is sort of a subset of those tests. So I'm not going to cover all the tests that we do, but I am going to talk with you a little bit about some of the tests that you can easily do on your own farms if you want to track your own soil health in a quantifiable fashion. It can be a great addition to your record keeping on your farm to add some quantified measures of your soil health. It can help you test how your management practices are impacting your soil health, and it can help you learn to observe aspects of your soil that will help you improve those things. So Monique, I wonder if maybe we want to go ahead and start with the first video.
All right, I am sharing that. And you can just
Thank
let
you
me
so
know when you want to stop.
That
And
sounds
so I know
good.
there are different segments.
Great.
Should I start?
Yeah, and let's just also say if anybody's having trouble watching the video because of the internet connection or something, that you did send out, right, a link to where people can view that separately from this feed. Is that correct?
Yeah, that might be, I know that, Jeremy, do you want to
Yeah.
pipe up about that?
I'll put it in the chat box right now.
Great,
Awesome.
thank you.
So
Yeah,
if
for those of you who have slow internet like me, if you're having trouble viewing the video, you can view it on your own computer.
All right, here we go.
Great.
So I'm Caro Roszell. I'm the Education Director with NOFA MASS, Northeast Organic Farming Association, Massachusetts chapter, and I am also our Soil Carbon Program Coordinator and a soil health consultant. And I am out here today at Massaro Community Farm in Woodbridge, Connecticut. And what we're doing today is demonstrating a soil health assessment, or soil carbon proxy test, as we call it at NOFA. So before you begin to conduct your full tests, if you're a technician doing this test for a farmer, you want to conduct an interview with the farmer to get history of their farming practices, such as tillage, mulching, cover cropping, and the last few crops in this field, things like what fertilizers they're using if they're applying compost. And you want to record things like the weather and the temperature, obviously the date, because you want to conduct this test at the same time every year, and draw your map to where the test is taking place. At that point, you can move on to begin your tests. So there's two ways to use these tests if you're doing your own soil health assessment for your farm. One is to do a comparison test. So that would be to test two different fields or two different areas in your field or multiple areas in your field. In that case, you'd want to choose different locations within your field that you know have different soil conditions, such as higher, lower, rockier, less rocky, wetter, not as wet, and compare those. If you're going to be using this method for tracking change over time to look at your management practice and how that's affecting your soil health from year to year, you would just choose one location in your field that's representative of your field and look at that same exact spot every year. Because as we know, soil conditions are variable, so you want to choose one spot and compare that over time. The materials for doing this test are really quite simple. It's just a long surveyor's tape. I had a 150-foot tape. I switched to a 300-foot tape for different farms, because what you really want to be able to do is measure from a permanent landmark. So on this farm, what I've done is looked to the absolute corner of the farm. I'm going to draw a map with cardinal directions, and I've counted from that corner 8 posts. So when I record the location for the spot, it'll be count 8 posts up from the southwest corner, and then measure 115 feet and 6 inches to the center of the test location at 185 degrees on my cell phone compass. So that's basically the directions I'll record for myself. There's also some water mains nearby, just simple metal poles that indicate where the water sources are. So if you wanted to get really fancy, you could use your compass and actually also in your surveyor's tape and triangulate from those spots if you wanted to get really precise. You can also use GPS apps on your phone, but they're generally not as precise as these directions you can make for yourself. The materials that I've used for this, like I mentioned, a 300-foot surveyor's tape. This is just simple PVC pipe cut to a specific length and joined with a simple coupler kit that you can get at Home Depot or your local hardware store. And the goal is to make a 30-inch diameter hoop. This just allows you to better estimate percentages of cover. And the hoop is just to sort of help you focus on a specific area of a contained amount of space. And what the goal is to estimate the percentage of living cover, residues or dead cover, and bare soil in the hoop. And the test is conducted from a standing position looking down for estimates. So we're not getting down here and like moving the plants around to kind of like look at the bare soil. This is just a simple surface observation. So from my
Let's pause for a second, Monique.
I'm seeing is about 5%.
Thanks. Okay, so I just sort of jumped right into the observation test, which is the first test, but I did want to pause for a second and say, so what that was doing is sort of setting up how to find your test location, and I just want to reiterate that if you are looking to track your management practices over time on a single field, it's a good idea to identify a single location and then come back to that same location. So just whatever works for you to find a good way to identify your spot year after year. But you can also use this test to compare two different fields with different management practices, or your production space and then your field edge, or even a wooded area or like a wild field nearby to sort of get a good comparison. I also wanted to briefly just say that, you know, I mentioned that we call these the carbon proxy tests. We also call them soil health assessment. The reason for that interchangeability of terminology is that the health of your soil is roughly correlated or closely correlated with the amount of carbon in your soil. And when we say health, what we mean is the amount of the living portion of the soil. So soil is an ecosystem, and the carbon in that soil is mostly the living portion of that soil. So even things that die and decompose, decomposition itself is a living process of decomposing microbes in the soil, right? So the goal for increasing carbon in the soil broadly is to increase the amount of soil biodiversity, or really, you know, soil living things. But when we say biodiversity because the more complex a living system is, generally, the more life it supports, right? So if you think of like the complexity of an Amazon rainforest and its biodiversity versus a simplified turf grass landscape, for instance, there's more life in an Amazon rainforest. It's a much more complex system. So what a lot of these tests are getting at is actually kind of like ways of looking at the total life in the soil and the biodiversity of the soil and the carbon in the soil, and those things are all connected. So what the test that I'm about to talk about in this video is our surface biology test. And we always start with this test because it's important. The first step in thinking about your soil health should be the plant health, right? So, you know, I think one of the great things about farms like Assawaga Farm is that intensive planting means that you have more plants present per square foot of soil. And whether we're talking about a cover crop or we're talking about a cash crop, that means more photosynthesis per square foot. There are big, huge companies that are getting lots of carbon offset subsidies from these different carbon, you know, carbon farming schemes. And I'm talking about like big Midwestern multi-thousand acre farms. And a lot of the way that they're actually accounting for their carbon sequestration, hiring a company to do satellite imaging to show how many days that farm has in living cover. So they have pretty good modeling that can show that, you know, this soybean farm had, you know, like 250 days in soybean cover, and then like over the winter they had a cover crop on and they had this many days in bare soil. You know, that kind of calculation, you can produce decent carbon sequestration modeling from that. So remember, when we think about soil health, think about plant cover. So I'm going to talk about this right now in the video, and we can start it in a second, but just, you know, just to give you a quick primer, what we're doing here is estimating percentage of cover of the soil overall, including plant residue and living plants, and then living plant cover, and then bare soil. So I think we can go ahead and play, Monique.
Bare soil, very little what I would call residue, less than 2%, maybe closer to 1% of residue, just kind of dead plants, and mostly living plants, which is really good. There's actually companies now that work for farmers by conducting satellite imagery of their farms to estimate the number of days in living cover that farm has. We're talking big farms out in the Midwest, big row crop farms. And you can actually get a pretty good estimate of the amount of carbon you're sequestering on your farm from your days in living cover, because the carbon that's moving into the soil is mostly moving into the soil through the process of photosynthesis, right, of CO2 being converted into carbohydrates, which are carbon-rich sugar compounds. So what we're seeing here is mostly living cover, which is really good. So we have about 95% living cover. A good trick for estimating percentage of different components in a 30-inch hoop is that a hand fully outspread is about 6% of a 30-inch diameter hoop. My hands are pretty small, so I usually estimate more like 5% for my hand. If you don't spread your fingers, that's closer to 4%. The side of your fist, so like thumb side down, which is a little hard to do, but like that, is supposed to be about 1%, and a thumbprint is 1/3%. So hopefully that's helpful if you need visual estimating tools. The other thing you want to record in your data sheets, which we will provide a link to be able to access the whole manual and data sheets for these tests, is the species richness or species diversity inside the hoop. So looking here, what I'm seeing are chickweed, vetch. This is some kind of an aster. It looks like something in the daisy family. Oh, there's also a wild onion. So I would say that this is primarily vetch, probably about 90% vetch if we're thinking about it from a canopy dominance perspective, with maybe 7% chickweed visible, and the remaining 3% is a mix of these asters and wild onion. The importance of the species diversity really has to do with the fact that different soil microbes partner with different plant families. So part of increasing soil life and increasing soil carbon is about increasing the life in the soil. And you can support more life in the soil if you have a more biodiverse soil ecosystem. An ecosystem that is dominated by one plant is only going to support a more limited set of soil microbes. So that's part of why species richness is important, and why cover crop cocktails are a really, really good strategy for increasing soil health. And at this point, we can say that the soil temperature is 59 degrees. The next thing we're going to do is remove the hoop and...
Let's pause before we dig a hole. So I just posted a link to our last version of the soil carbon growers manual. So you can use that link to download a workbook with instructions for doing these tests. We do have a few revisions for our next version of the manual, which is coming out soon. And that manual just actually brings some of our protocol alignment with the NRCS recommended protocols for in-field soil health assessment, which is just being released this spring and early. Our goal at NOFA MASS is really to, and with the other NOFA chapters, is really to be able to have a set of protocols that is aligned with NRCS's approach to doing in-field soil health assessment as much as possible. We do go a little bit deeper and more detailed on some things, but we do want our protocols to be able to be used by growers who are seeking to apply for EQIP and CSP programs through NRCS. So our technical assistance program should be able to be used to support an application to EQIP or something like that. So if you have more questions about how the NOFA carbon proxy tests integrate with EQIP, you can email me at caro@nofamass.org. So I did want to just explain a little bit about why we have a revision. But check out the link in the chat in order to be able to see the manual and workbook for these tests if you're going to be doing them on your own farm. So I think we're going to dig a hole next. We can start that video, Monique.
We're going to do a number of things with this hole, but it's important that we want to dig a cubic foot of the soil and displace it into a bin or a tarp. I used to carry a tarp around, but I've just moved on to kind of really preferring having a bin. The reason for that is we're going to be looking for earthworms in that bin, and I just find it a little easier as I'm getting to the end of my cubic foot of soil to sort through it from a bin. In this particular hole, the majority of the roots seem to terminate at about 5 inches, which is really good for springtime. And we have at least one root that goes all the way to 12 inches, and I'm seeing a couple other ones that are at about 10 or 11 inches, so that's really good. So it doesn't appear that any of the roots are sort of heating compaction points. None of the roots are abruptly turning sideways. None of them appear to be balling up. So we have good root behavior. The next thing we're looking for are biopores, or sort of channels in the roots left by earthworms and roots. And at this point, we just count what we see in terms of biopores in the whole walls. I'm seeing about 3 visible biopores on average per wall. So about 12 in the whole. Just double check.
Maybe we could pause here, Monique, and show that picture I sent you. Did you see the pictures I sent you?
No, I didn't get to those.
Oh, sorry. I can pull them up in screen share if that's helpful. And just,
Can you screen share if you're on the phone?
yes. Let me just open that up one moment, folks. Sorry, I sent it kind of late. Probably you were already in the field day. I apologize for that. So let me take screen sharing from you, and then we'll hand it back. So can folks see my screen?
Oh, that's great.
All right. So I just prepared a few pictures to illustrate some of these points. So in this picture, can you see the biopores? Is that showing up all right?
We're seeing root sheathing.
Oh, okay.
Biopores, yes.
Biopores, okay. So I prepared this picture just because I realized when I was talking to folks last night on a different webinar about this topic that it can be a little hard to know what a biopore is. So in this picture, I was digging my my potatoes because I haven't figured out how to do potatoes no-till yet. So I still do dig in my field for planting my potatoes. And I thought this was a really good example of biopores. So when you're digging your hole, something we've added that's not in the current manual but will be in the revised manual is that we count the biopores that are visible in the hole walls. This is something that NRCS does, and I think it's really smart. The presence of biopores just is a way of indicating activity of earthworms and also roots, and some biopores are produced by roots dying and leaving a hole through the soil. This is highly correlated with really high soil health, and it can be a great indicator of your soil health. So some soil types might not show them as well, but that's something you can learn with your own soil is look for these. Sometimes you also see earthworm eggs near these biopores in the soil, which is really fun. That's a fun thing to be able to look for, is if you Google pictures of earthworm eggs, they're little brown pods in the soil, and you can start to look for those as well as another indicator. And then I will just talk about root sheathing for a moment, because we're about to talk about that in the video, and I just want to make sure I show you a good picture. Root sheathing is basically the coating of soil on your plant roots. I really recommend using grasses as your indicator for this. You don't always have a grass in your observation hoop in your in the test area. So just look for one near your test area if there's not a clump of grass. If that wasn't included in your cover crops, usually you'll find grass popping up anyway. You can use other types of species too. You know, I think a lot of things in the pea family do form good associations, but I wouldn't recommend things in the brassica and onion family because they don't tend to have good root sheaths. So stick to a few species when you're doing comparisons or change over time. But basically what root sheathing is an indicator of is a really robust rhizosphere. So when plants are photosynthesizing functionally and when there's good soil biology present, then what happens is you have your mycorrhizal fungi wrapping around your plant roots, and the roots are pumping out, the plants are pumping out exudates into the soil, so carbohydrates and other compounds into the soil to feed the mycorrhizal fungi and the biology in the soil. And there's sort of mucousy nature to exudates and to fungal glues and biological glues. So you get this nice mix of soil particles and biological glues and root exudates, and that forms this sheath around the root. And when you pull up a plant that has a really rich rhizosphere, a really rich ecology of the roots, you'll get this nice root sheathing, with the exception of certain plant families like brassicas. And a cool feature about this, I was just actually reading up a little bit about root sheathing this morning over my coffee, is that when you go through a dry spell on your farm, that mucilaginous and like sticky root sheath actually will compress in dry weather and tighten up, and it actually prevents your root system of your plant from losing water into the rest of the soil when the soil is getting dry. So it's actually a feature of why soils that have good organic matter and good biology help your plants resist wilting in dry weather, and it's part of that whole story of why soils that are rich in life hold more moisture. So I think we can continue the video, Monique, and I'll want to pause again when we start talking about aggregates so I can come back to these pictures. So you can just take over sharing again.
You got it?
Great.
10. Yeah. The other thing we're looking for in the hole is the depth of topsoil. So what we're looking for is a color change. On a farm that's tilled regularly, I usually see a pretty bright line of dark colored topsoil, light colored subsoil, usually at around 9 inches, typically. And that's, the depth of the plowing on that farm. And they develop a plow pan, so you just see a really sharp distinction. On a farm like Assawaga Farm that has been using no-till practices, you often see a much fuzzier gradation, a marbled appearance, and we clearly see that on this site. The color change from the dark topsoil to the lighter subsoil is much more gradual, and like I said, marbled is the best way to describe it. So you see here on this slice with the painter's trowel, which is a really important tool for your soil health assessment. Painter's trowels are invaluable. We have this nice dark topsoil, but it doesn't transition abruptly to the lighter colored subsoil, and that to me is a sign that the merging of the subsoil and topsoil is happening a lot through root and worm and other biological activity, and not through just plowing and turning over one layer of the soil. Another aspect of the soil system that we're looking at when we do the digging a hole test is root sheathing. So this is basically the strength of the relationship between the plants that are growing on site and the soil community. You can see here that these roots are very tightly sheathed in soil, so that you can't see very much of the primary root through the soil clinging to it. Grass is one of the better, I just went and grabbed this clump of grass because grass is one of the better plant families to test this on. But it's a sign that there's really strong relationship between the soil biology and the plant. So there's a lot of exchange happening in the form of carbohydrates and other components of the root exudate that is causing the ecology of the rhizosphere to have a strong connection with the plant. Other plant families that relationship is going to look a little different. Like typically, as most growers know, onions their roots don't tend to sheath as much. Here we have some chickweed that you can see a lot of the root through it, but at the same time, there's a lot of aggregation growing off of these roots. But generally, if you have a grass present, I like to stick with a grass to test the root sheathing. I just go find one near the test location if there's not one right in the hoop. But this is really, really nice sheathing here. If you saw just kind of, if it was more similar to the onion root and you could see a lot of the root through the soil, that's less good sheathing. That's not as good sheathing. So you're really looking for that really nice thick coating of soil in the root. Next test is aggregation. And this part's probably the trickiest part of the whole set of protocols. What we're doing is classifying the aggregates that we find in the soil. And we want to be using the NRCS classifications for aggregates, so you can actually find a full description on soil aggregation in a field book called the Field Book for Describing and Sampling Soils, which is put out by NRCS. You can find that on their website. We have sort of a simplified version of their categories in the protocols, just to make it a little easier for you. But if you wanted the expanded version of it, you can use their original resource. But what you do is you create a slice of your soil and you place it in front of you to look at. And what we do in our protocols is we classify the aggregates in the top 4 inches, 4 to 8, and 8 to 12. And so I've actually compressed them just a little bit here, just to make it a little easier to see. So we want to be looking at the aggregation at 3 different levels, 0 to 4, 4 to 8, and 8 to 12. So this is 0 to 4. You can see here that there's a lot of really nice aggregation. I would call this granular aggregation. And this is fine to medium size. And for a full description of those distinctions and those different categories, you can look at our manual, which we're providing a link to with this video. But these are granular aggregates because they're relatively circular. And the size classification is fine to medium, which has to do with the number of millimeters of diameter the little aggregates have. But the other aspect is prevalence. So prevalence is the relative preponderance of the aggregates compared to either solid compacted soil or loose playground sand, kind of like falls through your fingers, not aggregated soil or unaggregated soil. So this is, I would call this a strong prevalence. We usually grade weak, moderate, or strong, and this is definitely strong because I'm seeing basically no unaggregated soil here. Oh, here's a nice macro aggregate. Oof, that's beautiful. It's got some vetch nodules in there, rhizobacteria in there. But yeah, you can see that as you break apart the macro aggregate, it just breaks apart into smaller aggregates. So that's a strong prevalence. The middle profile, 4 to 8 inches, we have, you can see that we have actually more what looks like coarse, blocky aggregates. Granular aggregates are considered higher soil health. These are larger, but they're not as separately aggregated, and they are, as you break them apart, they're kind of not falling apart into this cottage cheese kind of appearance, but they're a little bit more chunky. Still, I would call these aggregates and not kind of clods because they have good porosity, and they're nice and dark in color, and there's roots moving through them, and there's little pores in them. But as we move deeper and we start to get into some of the subsoil, if you were to find just chunks of soil that are hard, like rocks, and are very smooth on the edges, don't have good porosity, you're starting to get into what is just massive soil or just clods of soil that aren't really aggregated. But this is still kind of in the realm of what we would call aggregated soil. But there's no real bright line between those categories of clod and aggregate. It's a little bit subjective. I've had many conversations with my state NRCS soil scientists to sort of help try to define these things, and really it's just a matter of exploring, and it's a little bit subjective, but this is still really nicely has a lot of surface area, and it's it's in the realm of cloddy because there's less roots going through it, the color is lighter, and it's blocky. But as we head down into the soil profile, we're looking at a weaker aggregation, blockier. Up here we have granular and strong prevalence, and as we go down, we're finding weaker prevalence and blockier structure.
I have some photos to help explain this, Monique, if you want to pause for a second.
Yeah.
Great. So this is the hardest part of soil health classification. So let me just screen share and show you a couple pictures that I pulled up today to try to help explain this. So again, this is somewhat subjective, and the terminology is the realm of professional soil scientists, and I know it's even a little confusing for them. But when we're looking at this chart, I'm afraid it's a little fuzzy, but there's a great there's a link here to this paper, Simple Field Methods for Measurement and Evaluation of Grassland Quality, that goes into some of these some of the fine details of these soil health classifications if you're interested in really getting nerdy about it. But this shows sort of are you all seeing this chart here? Structure, quality, use of breakup, size of aggregates?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is one of the methodologies that's been developed for describing and explaining soil health. So, oh, Kip is here, good. So maybe I'm noticing that Kip is commenting. So yeah, Kip, if you wanna chime in on this at all, because this is an area where it's probably more your realm. Maybe we can unmute you, but I think this is sort of a little bit of a helpful guide where it shows kind of this more massive soil at the bottom of the chart, and as you head up, we see that porosity is increasing. Again, I know this is not a very high quality slide, but one of the ways to look at the gradations from kind of massive soil to aggregated soil is that porosity increases, and the structure changes from more of a blocky structure or a massive structure to a more granular structure. Kip, would you like to talk a little bit about this since you're here? Can we do that, Monique? Is that all right?
Yeah, if he can unmute himself.
Sorry, Kip, to put you on the spot. Are you willing to share a little bit about how to classify aggregates? I always defer to the soil scientists in the room on this topic. Kip, are you there? All right, if not, I have another picture here that will hopefully help show the difference between massive and...
Oh, okay.
Oh, there you are,
I'm
great.
unmuted now. That's great.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Hi.
Thanks.
So,
hello. Yeah, so part of it is to have the understanding of kind of what your soils are. What are the inherent properties? So again, go to the web soil survey, locate your property, get an idea. Are you in glacial till, which is ground up and placed down by the glacier? Are you in meltwater, sand and gravel? Those all will influence of what kind of expectations that you may have for the structure of the soil or the aggregates that were described. And then typically, as was, I thought you did a good job of describing in most cases, because most of our agricultural soils, if you're in a natural soil that has previously been in agriculture, there would have been a plow layer, which is where if you just looked at a forested soil, you would find surface, kind of rotted leaves and a very thin organic layer, and then a little bit of a topsoil layer. But basically, when you plow, you're mixing all those. So basically, anything that's previously been in agriculture, that 8 to 12 inches is what typically the plow would have homogenized all those. So now you're looking at the combination of the structure as was described of these aggregates, and typically in that topsoil layer where you have the most biological activity and the most that you're going to see these smaller aggregates of either a granular or crumb structure. And then as you get farther down, because there's less biological activity, our soils are geologically young, some of our soils younger than others, you typically don't find as much of that granular. And we start to get into that next layer, as was described, the subsoil layer, where you'll see that color change at anywhere from, 6 to 15 inches down. Typically, you will expect that it'll be larger kind of chunks, what we typically would call subangular blocky structure. And then the other is you want to look at how firm they are and the resistance. And also, I thought was good that you noted, as you're digging down through, how does it feel as you dig down through? Do you hit like a hard layer? And then when you bring up chunks of soil, is it coming apart into plates, like little layers, in which cases that's showing some compaction and possibly a plow pan? Or is it just kind of coming out into chunks, and it's just, you would expect in that subsoil layer that it's always going to be a little bit firmer than it would be in that topsoil layer, where you have all the roots and the biological activity and the finer structure to it. So I'll stop there and let you continue.
That was very helpful, Kip. Thank you. So yeah, you can see in this image here, I thought this was kind of a helpful image. This is not a New England soil, so you might not see something that looks so much like this, but just in sort of seeing it as an example, this more massive, on the left-hand side, we have this more massive soil. This is from a no-till and a tilled, I think, example on 2 different fields, but this is actually in Finland. So you can see there's an executive summary of a paper that you can access if you're interested in Googling improving phosphorus availability and reducing emissions through soil health experiences from 24 test fields. There's some interesting data in that paper. But yeah, so this is just an example of something you might see. It would look a little different on New England soils, but this sort of massive structure, you can see it breaking apart into what we call a platy structure in the middle here. And then on the left, the right-hand side, we have more of a soil health treated and no-till plot that you can see it has. We have these subangular blocky aggregates that have low porosity. You see up higher, we see a lot more porosity on the soil structure higher up in that profile. So just some features to notice. I really recommend that you get to know your soil structure on your own farm, that you go out and dig a bunch of holes and look at your 12 inches of profile to get to know what soil structure looks like in different spots on your farm. It can be really helpful to, if you are doing kind of a no-till operation, it might be a good idea to dig up maybe your farm road to see what a really compacted soil looks like, what the structure looks like there. Compare it to your production field, and then compare that to your, your field edge where you don't see a lot of disturbance, or the native vegetation at the edge of your farm. And just kind of get to know it, because the structure on your farms and the aggregates themselves are going to vary a lot by your soil type, as Kip was saying. So it's really important to just kind of get to know what healthy looks like in your soil structure, and also get to know some of the features of your soil, like do you have a compacted layer, a historic compacted layer on your farm, or even a current compacted layer from current management practices. I do tend to find a lot of historic compaction on farms that have been no-till for a while. Most of the currently tilled farms that I look at have a plow pan of anywhere from 6 to 9 inches, and I'm seeing a lot less. The compaction layer is often broken up a lot more or lower on tillage-reduced farms. So that is what I'm going to say about structure. Monique, you want to continue with the video? You can take sharing back from me.
Mm-hmm.
In that cubic foot of soil that we displaced from the hole when we were first digging our hole, that's why we're putting in a bin. Generally, the beginning, there's not going to be much earthworms in the top because they've all gone down to the bottom, so that's usually where all the action is, but we're just going to sift through it. First thing to do is take your little cup that you're going to be putting your earthworms in and put a little moist soil in it so that they have habitat and they don't dry out. If it's a really hot, dry day, I usually put a little water in the cup too so that they're comfortable while I'm counting them. So at this point, as I am searching for worms, I am filling the hole back in that we dug handful by handful. It's worth mentioning here that if you're doing a technician level protocol of the carbon proxy test, you actually want to do your bulk density test before this point because you need that hole. But this is a demonstration of the more farmer gardener friendly protocol, so we're not going to do bulk density on this video today. We found 6 earthworms in the soil. So this is one of the most seasonally variable tests that we do. It's really important to really do this test at the same time every year because your earthworm count in your cubic foot of soil is going to vary a lot by time of year, temperature, moisture conditions, but time of year being one of the things you can control. So taking the test at the same time every year, you should expect to see fewer earthworms in the summertime than you would in the spring or the late fall. The infiltration test is a test that measures how quickly water infiltrates into the soil. Different aspects of the soil structure, how well aggregated it is, how good the sort of capillary action is from root channels and earthworm channels into the soil. All of those things impact it, whether there's surface crusting. So it's a really good measure of soil health. Typically we see anywhere from 4.5 seconds to up to 45 minutes for this test. It's really wide ranging. We'd like to see things under 20 seconds. Ideally, under 10 seconds is really good. So the way to do this test is you bang in a cylinder. This is just a basic sewer, 6-inch sewer pipe, plastic sewer pipe that's been sharpened, cut to 6 inches and sharpened on one end. Use a piece of scrap lumber to pound it in with a mallet. And then we use just basic cling wrap covering the surface to allow us to pour the water in and then start the infiltration all at once. For a 6-inch cylinder, it's 444 milliliters of water that we use. So I just carry a jar that has that amount marked out on, and I pour it into that container on site and then into the cylinder with the plastic on it. Pull the plastic off and start my cell phone stopwatch at the same time. Any stopwatch will do. Since I use a phone for so many aspects of these tests, it's just the easiest thing. And so this test was, we got 17 seconds for infiltration, which was a good reading. This penetrometer test tells us the depth to compaction in a soil. Most roots for standard crop plants can't penetrate soils that have pressures of 300 pounds per square inch or more of pressure required to penetrate the soil. So for this simple tool, this is an Agritronics penetrometer, has 2 dials on it, one for a small tip and one for a larger tip, which you just decide to use based on how firm the soil is on site. And the dial tells you basically under 200, between 200 and 300 PSI and over 300 PSI. The penetrometer has 3-inch marker lines along the shaft, which you use to sort of tell where you are. It's a little bit of it's kind of like driving, learning to use this because you have to scan a lot of different things at once. But basically the way to use it is you place it on the soil surface. You want to make sure you can see those lines. And you're applying a steady pressure and you're looking at the line and the dial and the line and the dial and the line of the dial at the same time, basically going back and forth. So I'm getting, as I was passing the 3-inch mark there, I was at about 100 pounds per square inch. So you continue applying steady pressure and you're looking at the dial. I'm at 200 now as I go past 6 inches, and then about 210 as I go past 9. As we're hitting 12, I'm at about 250. And I'm encountering a little bit of resistance from gravel, it feels like. As we go to 15, I'm up at 300 now, and I can't push the penetrometer any farther down. So I will take 3 readings for the growers. I usually throw out a reading where I hit a rock pretty early on in the process. If a soil tends to have a lot of rocks all at the same level, then we just have to live with that as our reading. But I'll give them the average of those 3 readings, which is generally a better indicator than any one individual reading, since soil is variable. And it's important for the grower to know where, if they have a plow pan, if there's like a zone of the soil where the PSI is 300 or over, because that's the pressure at which roots can't penetrate. And then I also like to flag readings of 250 and over, because such a small percentage of crop roots can penetrate it at 250. So the slate test is basically
Monique, maybe should we pause and encourage folks to go and watch the slate test on their own, since we're so close to 7:30? I do want you to be able to do your microscopy video.
Oh, I think we'll skip that today.
Are you sure?
Yeah, we're good.
All right. Should we just ask folks if they have any questions then, and folks can go watch the slate test on their own?
Sure. I will stop sharing.
Okay. Sorry, I guess I talked too much in between, so we ran out of time to do the rest of those tests. But check out the slate test video on your own time afterwards. That's a really simple test that you can do. And just on the penetrometer, an Agritronics penetrometer, you can get them online. They're about $170. If you're really invested in soil health on your farm, it's a great tool to have around, and you can just periodically go out and do some readings on different fields and kind of get an idea of where your compaction is on your farm. So do folks have any questions in the last few minutes about the tests that we covered today and why they're important?
I don't know if I can unmute everyone at once. So Dina, are you still there? She might have had to go with her kids.
I am. I'm here.
Okay.
You know, Caro has done such a good answering most of these in the screen, I think, on the side. I don't see too many that have emerged. If you do have questions, of course, put them in the chat screen. The chat will be saved. A number of people have asked that, along with the recording of this evening's presentations. So that will all be available for you in the future. I think it will be, Jeremy, you can correct me, I think it's on our YouTube channel and on our website. I just wanted to, in conclusion, thank everyone so much. I think, you know, speaking for me personally, this evening has been such a shot in the arm. It's been a rainy, drizzly day here on our farm. I had to write to our CSA members today and talk about the hardships of this pandemic, many of whom, you know, in our CSA at our farm are new to interacting with local agriculture, and they are joining us on what's been a really challenging spring in Connecticut. It's been cold, and so many of us are slightly delayed. And so writing that for CSA email, one of the things that this evening has really driven home to me is that despite the challenges that are happening above the soil with some of our crops in this cold weather, the real nation building service of what happens on our farms, on organic farms across Connecticut, is exactly what Yoko and Alex and Caro have been talking about. The nation building is what's happening under the surface and in the soil, both with carbon sequestration and sort of diversity of life. So I'm echoing only more fervently what Alex has said, that the best fertilizer is the farmer's footprints. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I'm so grateful to all of us for coming together. I would like to ask, though, in the spirit of keeping this inspiration and this community going, Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind putting that form. It was important to us at NOFA that this event be free and that it be an open registration that anybody could join. And obviously we had tons and tons of people who took advantage of that. But please do let us know. There is a link here in the chat box for you. Because it is free, there wasn't registration, and we don't know who you all are, and we don't necessarily have all of your emails. We have a lot of new people coming to join our community these days, and we want to make sure we stay connected to you. So follow that link in the chat once this is done, and make sure that you let us know who you are, and in specific, if you have comments on the evening, things you want to see us do for future programming, and also if, for Caro, if the soil carbon proxy test is coming to Connecticut, if you would be interested in us following up with you and bringing that soil carbon test to your proxy test, excuse me, to your farm. So again, thank you all. Happy farming, and we will look forward to seeing you again soon as our webinar series continues over the next couple of months, and then again at Massaro for a field day on tillage reduction in September. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks so much for the opportunity to talk about soil.
Thank you, Caro.
It was really fun.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.